In this discussion, we are going to narrate the history of the rise of Gandhi in Indian politics. We have already studied Gandhi's philosophy, the concept of Satyagraha, and a new method of agitation that Gandhi introduced into the anti-imperialist struggle, combining certain moderate ideas with extremist visions. The main purpose of this discussion is to look at the different stages through which Gandhi eventually achieved a certain kind of prominence, some kind of dominance as well in nationalist politics. Initially, he started working outside the Congress. He had links with the Home Rule League, and then, after his successful organization of several local satyagrahas at Champaran, Khera, and then Ahmedabad, he made the first attempt to start an all India satyagraha on this very important question of Rowlatt Act. Judith Brown, in a fairly well known and influential book, suggested that Gandhi's rise represented the breaking of the politics of limitation.
Excuse me, sir, what does Judith Brown mean by this politics of limitation?
The basic argument is that before Gandhi's rise in Indian politics, the nationalist movement remained limited regionally and also remained limited within a smaller body of people. As you know, that early nationalism had not been able to penetrate the rural world. So it was Gandhi's achievement that he managed to build bridges with the peasants from the countryside. Brown and a few other historians also suggest that with the rise of Gandhi, accompanied by the rise of a new generation of leaders, the center of gravity in Indian politics began to shift from the maritime cities like Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, the main centers of European commerce, the early strongholds of the British in India, where you come across the rise of a new intelligentsia. So it began to shift to the heartland of India, to the northern Indian plains. Lowe, for example, talks about the rise of the submerged regions. And certainly from these submerged regions came leaders like Rajendra Prasad, just to cite one example. There would be other examples as well. And so Brown's main argument, and which has some validity, that with the rise of Gandhi, with the organization of movements against the British on a large scale, in which the rural classes, particularly the peasants, were involved, new regions were brought within the nationalist movement. New classes were also brought within the nationalist movement. So in this sense, Brown actually talks about the breaking of the politics of limitation. Now the question is, how was this achieved? And there are many layers of explanations. Some would consider the personal factor to be very important, Gandhi's charisma. Others would be concentrating on the particular context during the war and after the war, which made conditions propitious for a man like Gandhi to introduce a completely new language of politics. Nehru, for example, described this period, the war years, and the period in the immediate aftermath of the war as particularly dull. He felt that Gandhi came as a fresh air, new ideas, new strategies, new visions about how nationalism should not remain limited to the mind of the leaders, but it was also try to appeal to the heart of the people. But whatever be the overall impression of men like Nehru, who as a young man was then expecting a major movement to grow in India at that time, the political situation in India during the war years was not entirely dull. There were activities, and you come across certain new trends, certain new kinds of activity, new group of political leaders who are perhaps waiting for their leader to arrive. And Gandhi came to offer them this new leadership.
Sir, what could be the reason for this new generation of leaders to look for greater amount of political activities directed against the imperial rule?
Different answers can be given to this question. For example, you have a new crop of leaders, like Nehru, who was a young man who was actually traveling through the countryside of United Provinces to acquire a first-hand knowledge about peasant life. C.R. Das, who had defended the revolutionaries in Calcutta High Court, also were brought within the nationalist movement through the activities of the Home Rule League. The Home Rule League activity, although focused mainly on discussions and circulating propaganda literature, however, gave an opportunity to people like C.R. Das in Bengal or to people like Jawaharlal Nehru, Satyamurthy, who through the activity of Home Rule League became associated with the national movement. Tilak came back to the Congress, and along with Tilak came back many of his followers. So there was an attempt on the part of the Congress to resolve some of the differences that had caused the split at Surat about 8 years ago. You have resolution of differences between the leaders of the Congress and the leaders of the Muslim League. Take, for example, the 1916 session of the Congress at Lucknow. The League was holding its session concurrently, and they had a certain kind of agreement known as Lucknow Pact of 1916, in which the Muslim leaders agreed to a little bit of underrepresentation in those provinces where they were a majority, and overrepresentation in provinces where they were a minority. And the Congress was willing to offer to the Muslim League a greater amount of representation in the Muslim minority provinces. It is in this context that one has to situate the contribution that Gandhi made to what I have already labeled time and again as the most important transformation in the national movement. Gandhi's charisma was certainly one important factor, because unlike many of the established leaders of the Congress, Gandhi was a new person who had not been tainted by his familiarity with the people. He had not actually spoiled his image, either in the endless political squabbles among the nationalist leaders. He had already developed a reputation as an important political personality, thanks to the very successful strategy of Satyagraha that he adopted in South Africa. You are all familiar with this story of how Satyagraha became a major weapon in Gandhi's hands against the apartheid. And with that reputation behind him, he came to India as a new man who was welcomed by Gokhale and who began to be involved in the activities of the Home Rule League. But when we consider this personal factor, it has to be borne in mind that Gandhi was aided by certain new circumstances as well, new conditions, social factors. The war situation and effect of the war on India was devastating, and it caused popular grievances. Taxes were rising, prices were rising, peasants had to pay more for ordinary consumer materials than they were earning. During the war, in the Punjab particularly, resentment was born out of the policy of army recruitment. Some coercive methods were also employed by the state to ensure a smooth flow of army men into the army. Army recruitment apart, the way fodder crops were exported, food crops were exported to meet war demands elsewhere in the world also was responsible for a very substantial increase in food prices in the province. But generally in India after the war, the rise in taxation, and this rise in taxation was to some extent unavoidable, considering that the colonial state in India had to bear the burden, had to face this contingency of mobilizing enough resources to meet the wartime expenditure, to pay off the loans that the government had incurred during the war, or to contribute to the war fund that the imperial authorities in London had demanded. So, because of all these reasons, rising taxation was unavoidable. Income tax was rising, which directly affected the ordinary middle classes. But what was even more oppressive was the kind of indirect tax that came by in the form of excise. An increase in excise tax, whether it was custom duties or excise duties, pushed up consumer prices to a large extent to create irritation in the mind of the people, particularly at a time when their income was falling, particularly the peasants who, I have said already, were earning less and spending more for ordinary consumer materials. But one should not actually make an assessment of the war only in terms of the kind of popular resentment that wartime stringency had produced. There were gainers too. Businessmen had gained quite handsomely during the war. You are all familiar with the story of how during the war year, indigenous businessmen started investing in local industrial enterprises producing paper and other consumer materials. After the war, the problems that imperial finance was facing at that time led to imposition of customs duties on imported materials, including Lancashire textiles, and this gave an opportunity to local businessmen to prosper. They were investing in textile mills and they were able, within a short time, to establish their stronghold over the entire domestic market for textiles. So it was not as if that the impact of the war was affecting all the classes uniformly. If ordinary peasants or the middle classes were actually affected by rising prices and decrease in real income, the businessmen had certain advantages as well. And such businessmen were often found contributing to the nationalist fund. Particularly during the non-cooperation movement, the Congress had floated this Tilak Swaraj Fund, to which many businessmen came to contribute. So if popular grievances were producing a certain kind of strengthening of nationalist sentiment against imperialism, from another angle, the rise of businessmen and their growing affiliation with the Congress came as a threat to the imperial authorities. They found that businessmen were forthcoming with enough financial support to the Congress, to the nationalists. It is in this context that one has to situate Gandhi's rise in Indian politics. He was certainly a new man and obviously exerted a certain kind of appeal that many other contemporaries of his were failing to do that. But you have to consider the larger context of the disaffection caused by the war. Now, Gandhi worked out his strategy very well. So he started organizing local movements in order to establish his presence in Indian politics, in order to establish a distinct identity of his in Indian politics. And you are all familiar with the basic lineament of the story of how it all started with a local satyagraha at Champaran, followed by another local satyagraha with peasants at Kheda in Gujarat, then another local satyagraha at Ahmedabad where the workers were actually participating in the movement, and finally in 1919 you have the first attempt by Gandhi to undertake the All India Satyagraha around this very contentious question of the Rowlatt Act. The Rowlatt Act, as you know, gave Gandhi the opportunity to organize the first nationwide Satyagraha. It was not as if that all the regions of India were affected in the same way, but some of the urban areas, particularly in the Punjab, Delhi, partly Calcutta, and partly certain regions of Gujarat were affected by this new mode of mobilization that Gandhi had introduced. Champaran Satyagraha was Gandhi's first experiment with this new strategy of mobilization in India. Now, it was not as if that the peasants in this region had remained dormant in the earlier time, and suddenly with Gandhi's emergence, they became activated or they became energized. There was an ongoing resistance in the region since the 1870s against the planters, against the Tinkatia system, by which the planters coerced the peasants to produce indigo in a certain part of their land. But indigo, as you know, after the synthetic dye stuff was introduced in English textile mills, indigo was not a very remunerative crop. But the planters were forcing them to produce indigo despite the fact that indigo was not actually giving them enough money. The only way for the peasants to escape from this coercion was to pay the planters some money for getting freedom from this compulsion of producing indigo. So the rate that the planters charged for granting the peasants freedom also began to increase. The planters demanded a higher lump payment for the peasants to buy their freedom from this kind of compulsion. In districts like Motihari or Bettiah, such resistance had been going on from an earlier time. There was a local leadership coming up among the peasants, among the local people.
What was the nature of this local leadership?
Yes, it's a very important question, because when you look at such movements, you have to identify two different layers of leadership. One layer of leadership was represented by a man called Rajkumar Shukla, who was a petty trader who also dealt in money, had some amount of land, and could be counted as a rich peasant. It was he who had been complaining about the oppressive character of the Tinkatia system, who had mobilized peasants in Motihari and Bettiah, and who decided to approach Gandhi in 1916 in the Congress session at Lucknow. So Gandhi responded to Rajkumar Shukla's overtures, and when he came to Champaran and tried to transform this essentially local issue into a national issue, drawing attention of the larger body of people to this kind of oppression, he could rely on another kind of local leadership, some of which ultimately became extremely important in nationalist mobilization. These were men of middle class professions. People who were literate, educated, Western educated. Rajendra Prasad was one of them. Rajendra Prasad was a lawyer who was a brilliant student of English literature, and then he started practicing law in Motihari, and he became one of Gandhi's important lieutenants in organizing the Champaran Satyagraha. You have at the same time another such personality in Acharya Kripalani. Kripalani, as you know, became also a very distinguished Congress leader later, along with Rajendra Prasad. So you have another layer of local leadership who were not people like Rajkumar Shukla, who were more rooted to the soil. These were men of professions. These belonged to the local intelligentsia. These men became important support bases for Gandhi in organizing the Champaran Satyagraha. Now, the impact of the Champaran Satyagraha in the local context was not much. There were occasions when the peasants broke the Gandhian limit. They showed a kind of militancy which Gandhi would never endorse. But the fact that Champaran gave Gandhi a certain important foothold in Indian politics makes this particular attempt, the earliest one by Gandhi, to introduce his concept of Satyagraha important. Later on, Gandhi advised these followers of his who had gathered around him during the Champaran Satyagraha to concentrate on constructive work. But that has always been one of the main refrains in Gandhian politics. There was always an attempt to restrain, to check militancy, not to allow militancy to destroy the non-violent fabric of the movement. But at the same time, there would be persuasions by Gandhi among his followers to undertake constructive program when the movement was not organized or the movement was not going on. You can actually look at the Khera Satyagraha in Gujarat from a similar perspective. In Khera, an upwardly mobile peasantry who came to style themselves as patidars in order to distinguish themselves from the ordinary peasants known as kunbis in the locality, basically rich peasants who had made a little bit of money from tobacco cultivation and from dairy farming, had been affected by plague and famine at the turn of the 19th century. So they were a group of prosperous peasants who had seen better days. These people were affected by plague and famine. And at this juncture, when they had reasons for resentment, government decided to enhance the revenue demand. So obviously, there was a predictable resistance against this government decision to raise the revenue demand, and the movement has been going on for some time, not just in Khera, but also in an adjoining taluk called Bardoli. Bardoli would certainly become famous later because of the famous Bardoli Satyagraha in Surat district. And at Bardoli, there was an organization floated by such men, Patidar Yuvak Mandal. So it was from amongst them Gandhi could recruit a new crop of leadership. Vallabhbhai Patel, Vithalbhai Patel. So such men achieved distinction, achieved eminence as Gandhi's lieutenants who were members of the intelligentsia, members of the legal profession. The other important Satyagraha that Gandhi organized in his way to become the undisputed national leader, undisputed Congress leader, was the Ahmedabad Satyagraha among the workers. Also about this you are all familiar because the basic story is well known that Ambalal Sarabhai and others who were supporting the nationalist initiative, the mill owners of Ahmedabad, decided to suspend the plague bonus. So the workers looked for a more organized leadership from Gandhi. Gandhi offered this leadership but failed to restrain the workers to a large extent, as a consequence of which Gandhi had to float a different kind of labor organization which emphasized the importance of trusteeship, importance of maintaining a certain kind of amicable relationship between the workers and the mill owners. The workers were demanding a 50% wage rise, complaining about the rising prices since some of the mills were attacked. Some mill property was destroyed. Gandhi felt uneasy and formed the Textile Labour Association, through which Gandhi tried to implement the idea of trusteeship. And Gandhi's idea of a labour union was somewhat different from the growingly radical temper of labour union activity at that time. 1920 was the year in which the All India Trade Union Congress was set up, preceded by a large number of strikes in jute mills, in railway workshops, and in many industrial mills in India at that time. So this radicalism of the workers that was manifest through the activity of the labor unions and the formation of the All Indian Trade Union Congress didn't fit well with Gandhi's notion about what the labor what working classes were expected to do, or what should be the nature of the relationship between the working class and the mill owners. Now, these are questions to which to return as we go on, trying to disentangle some of the many nuances in Gandhian politics, but these three movements actually form the basis on which Gandhi made the first attempt towards a massive all India struggle in 1919. It is the Rowlatt Satyagraha, using the same kind of links and connections that Gandhi had forged with local leaders. The Muslims were unhappy with the way British imperial authorities were treating the Caliph of Turkey, became attracted to the mainstream nationalism through the Khilafadis. Obviously, this would become a much more important factor in the organization of the Khilafat non-cooperation movement in 1920-21. But before these attempts were made, on the basis of the connection that Gandhi had forged with the local leaders, with Home Rule leaguers, Gandhi made his first attempt towards organizing the Rowlatt Satyagraha.
Sir, what were the organizations on which Gandhi relied to organize an All India Satyagraha?
I have just mentioned that Home Rule leaguers were an important factor, and you have a new crop of Muslim leaders. They were thinking in terms of a more active role in the mainstream nationalism. The successful movement against the Rowlatt Act required these connections, these linkages that Gandhi had already forged. But Gandhi himself felt after a while that his preparation for the Rowlatt Satyagraha was not adequate, for which reason the Rowlatt Satyagraha did not conform to the principles of Satyagraha, but it is a very complex story,